Welcome to Holy Tuesday. This is the third day in the final week of the life of Jesus before he's crucified. I'm taking a little time each day of this Holy Week to highlight some of what went on in the life of Jesus on that particular day. There are some days where the gospel writers give us little detail, while others they describe a lot that happened. Tuesday happens to be one of those days. A lot happened, and a lot was recorded. As a matter of fact, one historical account I read titled Tuesday, quote, "The Busy Day," end quote. So there's no way that I can go over all that took place on Tuesday, aren't you glad? But I do want to hit some highlights and show you how it fits and applies to us today. It's amazing. At the close of Monday evening, let me start there, Jesus and his 12 leave Jerusalem again, and they go to stay the night at Bethany. The next morning, as they're making their way back to Jerusalem, they're passing by that fig tree that Jesus cursed and killed 24 hours before. And they're walking by and no one says anything when Peter finally speaks. "Hey, Lord, look, here's the tree that you cursed. You see it?" Jesus stops walking and he turns towards his disciples with that withered fig tree behind him, and he says, "I'll tell you what, if you'll have faith and not doubt, you'll be able to do this sort of thing and even more. You'll be able to look at a mountain and say to it, 'Be cast into the sea,' and it'll fall into the sea." So when you pray, Jesus said, believe and trust and don't doubt. And what you ask for will be given to you. And when you're praying, you must forgive anyone and everyone who you have something against, that you'll be forgiven. The silence came over the 12, and they turned and just kept walking toward Jerusalem. Once in the town, they went immediately to the temple where Jesus performed many, many different signs and miracles. The crowd was divided. Some were convinced as they watched that he was who he said he was, and they came to him in faith, while others just were unmoved and outright rejected him. There were, we are told, another group, though, and it was those who actually believed, but because they were leaders, they wouldn't publicly confess him because they were afraid that they'd be put out of the synagogue. Well, after watching these signs and wonders for a while and noticing that the crowds were growing, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the elders, they grew restless, and they knew they had to discredit him. "By whose authority are you doing these things?" they asked. Jesus said, "Let me ask you a question. John's baptism, was it from God or not?" This baffled them because they knew just how revered John was, and they knew that if they answered it was from God, then Jesus would say, "Then why didn't you believe his message?" But if they said no, it was not from God, then the people would riot because they were defaming John. So they answered Jesus, "We don't know." To which Jesus then said, "Then I'm not going to tell you by what authority I'm doing these things." Later they tried some different angles, some different tactics to trip him up. One asked, "Do you think it's lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar?" And Jesus looked at them and said, "Who has a coin? Give me a coin." They handed Jesus a coin, and he held it up before them, and he asked them, "Whose image is on this coin?" And they answered, "Caesar's." And Jesus said, "Then give to Caesar what is his, and give to God what is his." Another spoke up, and he said, "You know that the law of Moses teaches us that if a man is married and he happens to die without having any children, then his brother is to marry his wife and bear children for him. So let's say a guy has 7 brothers and they all marry her without having kids. Whose wife will she be in the resurrection?" And Jesus said, "You obviously don't understand the word of God, and you don't understand the power of God. There will be no marriage in the resurrection." One final person stepped forward to try to catch him. "So what do you think is the most important command in all of the law?" he asked. And without hesitation, Jesus answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might." And the second is just like that one. "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." And he finished by telling them that on these 2 laws, all of the law is summed up. Then Jesus unloads on the Pharisees and the scribes and the leaders. He unloads on them on this Tuesday by saying things like, "Woe to you! You guys tithe mint, dill, and cumin, but you neglect what is more important, things like justice and mercy and faithfulness. You guys like to clean the outside of the cup, but I see what's on the inside. The inside of the cup is filthy. It's dirty. You're like whitewashed tombs. Look really good on the ground, on the surface, but I know what's under them. Nothing but rotting bones. As he stood in the temple saying all of these things, he paused. He looked out over the crowd who were silent, listening to him, and his heart grew so heavy. And he said out over the crowd, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone all of those who are sent to you, if you only knew just how often I've wanted to gather you together like little children, the way a hen gathers her little chicks under her wings, but you would have nothing of it." Just then he looked over and he saw a lot of rich people who were lining up to deposit their money in the temple treasury. But what really caught his attention was this poor widow who shuffled up to the treasury box, and she put in these 2 little copper coins that amounted to about a cent. Jesus, without taking his eyes off of her, said to those around him, "Did you just see that? She just put more in that box than all of those rich people. They gave out of their wealth, but she gave out of her poverty. She just put in all she had to live on." And on this day, this Tuesday, Jesus gave his powerful, specific, prophetic teaching about the end times, what to look for, what to expect, what to avoid, how to be. And after he taught all these things about the end times, he gave several parables to emphasize just how important it is for us to be ready for his return, how to be awake, to be watchful, to be alert. He told one of the parables about 10 virgins who were in a bridal party. As bridesmaids, one of their responsibilities was to have lamps and extra oil for those lamps. No one knew when the bridegroom would arrive, so they had to be ready. Jesus said 5 of them were wise because they were ready, while 5 were foolish and they didn't have enough oil. When the bridegroom showed up, the 5 foolish widows begged the wise ones for some of their oil. The prepared, the wise virgins, they all replied, "We can't. There isn't enough for us and for you." So the fools left the bridal procession and they ran to town to try to purchase some oil, but when they returned, the wedding feast had already commenced. The door was shut. They pounded on the door screaming, "Please let us in." But the groom answered them, "I don't know who you are." And he wouldn't open the doors for them to enter. And Jesus ended this parable by saying, you need to be alert, be ready, and watchful, for you do not know the time and the place when this will happen. And one of the last stories that Jesus told was recorded in Matthew 25. It's one that I think we're all very familiar with when he said, "One day soon, the Son of Man will gather all the nations before him. And he'll separate them like a shepherd separates sheep from goats. And the sheep he'll move on his right, while the goats he'll move on his left. And he'll look over at the sheep first, and he'll say to them, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom that's been prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you came to me. I was in prison, and you visited me.' And the goats on his left, he'll say to them, 'Depart from me, from my presence, you accursed ones, into the eternal fire which has been prepared for the devil and his angels, because I was hungry and thirsty and naked and sick and in prison, and you did nothing.'" There is so much more that happened on this Tuesday. This is just a sampling. But in this short sampling, there's some really important, powerful lessons for us to consider, especially during this time of our crisis. Here's the first one I want to say. Faith and trust matter, infinitely so. And that's what Jesus wants us to learn from his cursing of the fig tree. When Peter brought it up, you would have thought that Jesus would have said something like, "Well, make sure you bear fruit in this life," but he didn't. He spoke to their amazement at what he had done, and he told them that if they had faith, they'd be able to do these kinds of things and more. Look to the withered fig tree. and see how much faith and trust in God matter. So much so that if you trust and believe while you pray, you'll receive what you're asking. That's what God said. God wants above all things to be trusted, for without faith it's impossible to please Him. If you come to Him, you must believe that He's there, that He exists, and He rewards those who seek after Him. He wants to be trusted without doubt and without wavering. There's a message here for us today, church. Living in a time like this where this world is rocking and the future is unknown, look to the fig tree and trust Him. The second one is that Jesus is Lord and His authority is unassailable and unchanging. They tried all they could to challenge His authority. They did all they could to think they could do to discredit Him and knock His legs out from under Him. They wanted to embarrass Him in front of everyone so that all the authority He was gaining by all of His acts and teachings would be removed from Him. But they couldn't do it. They failed. They failed miserably. So listen, let us take from this Holy Tuesday that His authority cannot be challenged. His authority is His and His alone, and no one can contest it. All we can do today in the middle of this difficult, confusing, unknown time, listen, is to bow, is to fear Him, is to revere Him and be in awe of Him. As this crisis continues and even increases, let the people of God bow in reverence and worship the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Here's a third thing. He always looks to the heart, and that's what He weighs. He could see right through those Pharisees and leaders of that time. He saw them for who they really were because their hearts were laid bare before Him. He saw the inside of their cup. He saw below the tombs of their lives. He called them on their hypocrisy. And listen, He didn't laud the amount that the rich were giving to the temple treasury. He saw their heart. He saw this impoverished widow give all that she had to live on, and it caught His attention. Friends, He wants us to love during this time, to serve, to speak the gospel, to give hope. But never forget that He's looking at the heart that's under all these acts. Finally, the end of this age is approaching. If ever there was a time where the people of God are being forced to see the end, it's now. We see the fragility of life and are being forced to face mortality. Jesus makes sure that we know on this Holy Tuesday that this is not all there is. This is temporary and fleeting. The eternal is approaching. Holy Tuesday urges us to live for the eternal and not the now. It compels us to put any hope in today and in this world, but rather put our hope in Him and the future He's promised. We are to be alert, stay watchful, don't get sluggish. Know that someday the end, you will be sheep or goat. There's no other option. You're sheep or you're a goat. And as you consider that, then always remember that Jesus says the difference between the two is seen in what you do or not do for those in need, for those who are less fortunate, for those who have made their horrible bed and now they're laying in it, those who are sick with coronavirus. What you do to these, you'll do to Him. And what you do not do to these, you're not doing to them. This is Holy Tuesday, my friends. Shalom.